I watched the groundbreaking ceremony from my own porch, a line of shiny shovels and a banner reading, Phase 3. 500 new homes coming to Willowmere Ridge. And I remember the specific, disbelieving calm that settled over me as I realized that the parcel they were standing on, the one their board president was giving an enthusiastic speech about, belonged entirely to me, had belonged to my family for 3 generations, and had never once been sold, leased, or transferred to the HOA, the developer, or anyone else involved in that ceremony. My name is Farouk Delacroix. My grandfather purchased 60 acres of undeveloped land on what was then the rural outskirts of our county nearly 60 years ago, land that my family has held, largely as agricultural and timber acreage, ever since, passed down through my father and eventually to me about 12 years ago following his passing. I want to establish clearly, because it matters enormously for everything that follows, that this land has always been held under a clean, unambiguous title, recorded properly with the county, with no liens, easements beyond a single utility corridor along its northern edge, or any other encumbrance that would have permitted anyone else to develop or transfer it. Willowmere Ridge, the HOA-governed development at the center of this story, was built adjacent to my family's land over the preceding 15 years, expanding in phases as its developer, a regional company called Heartcrest Development Group, acquired and built out additional parcels. I want to tell you that for most of those 15 years, I paid relatively little attention to the community's growth, my own property functioning as a quiet, largely undeveloped buffer between their expanding subdivision and the more rural land further out, an arrangement that had never caused any conflict or required any interaction between my family and the HOA at all. That changed the morning I watched that groundbreaking ceremony unfold on my own land. I want to walk you through my initial reaction, because I want to be honest that my very first thought was not legal outrage, but genuine, bewildered confusion, trying to understand how any responsible developer or HOA board could possibly have proceeded with a 500-home construction project, without first confirming they actually held clear title to the land involved. A step so basic to any real estate development process that I genuinely struggled to imagine how this oversight had occurred at all. I called the county recorder's office that same afternoon, requesting an updated title search on my own property, more out of a need to confirm my own understanding than any real doubt about what I already knew to be true. The search confirmed exactly what I expected. The parcel remained recorded under my family's ownership, with no transfer, sale, or any other title change reflected anywhere in the county's records. I want to introduce you to the HOA board president responsible for what happened, a woman named Priscilla Ashworth Vandermeer, who had championed this Phase 3 expansion as what she described, in the community's promotional materials, as the crowning achievement of Willowmere Ridge's growth story. A 500-home addition that had already, by the time of that groundbreaking ceremony, generated substantial buyer interest, with dozens of families having already placed deposits on homes planned for construction on what was, in reality, land that belonged entirely to me. I called the HOA management office directly, explaining the situation and requesting to speak with whoever had authorized the groundbreaking. And I want to tell you, the conversation that followed, once I finally reached Priscilla directly, revealed something that I still find genuinely difficult to fully understand even now. She insisted, with a confidence that struck me as almost willfully detached from reality, that the parcel had been properly acquired through the developer's standard land acquisition process, and that any title discrepancy must reflect an administrative recording error on the county's part rather than any actual ownership issue. I want to sit with that response for a moment, because it revealed, I think, either a genuine and remarkable failure of basic due diligence somewhere in this entire development process, or something considerably more troubling, a willingness to proceed with a massive, publicly promoted construction project without ever actually confirming clear title, apparently assuming that the sheer momentum and financial commitment already built into the project would somehow resolve any underlying ownership questions on its own. I want to walk you through what I did next, because I understood almost immediately that a simple phone call correcting a misunderstanding was not going to be sufficient given the scale of what was already underway. I contacted an attorney, a woman named Rosalind Nkemelu Ferreira, who specialized in real estate and title disputes, and brought her the county's title confirmation, along with everything I could find about the groundbreaking ceremony and the associated buyer deposits already collected. Rosalind reviewed everything within our first meeting and told me something that reframed the entire scope of what I was actually dealing with. "Farrokh," she said, "this is not simply a boundary dispute or an easement disagreement. If the title records are as clean as they appear, and I have no reason yet to doubt that, what you're describing is a developer and an HOA board that have promoted, sold deposits against, and now begun physical construction on a 500-home project built on land they have never actually owned. That is an extraordinarily serious situation, both for you as the legitimate property owner, and frankly, for every single family who has already put money down on a home that, as things currently stand, cannot legally be built where they've been told it will be. I want to tell you about the immediate legal step Rosalind recommended, because speed mattered enormously given that active construction, grading equipment, and initial infrastructure work was already underway on my own property by the time we had our first meeting. She filed for an emergency injunction within days, seeking an immediate halt to all construction activity on the disputed parcel, pending a full resolution of the title question, a filing that the court granted within a week, given how clear and well documented the underlying title records actually were. I want to walk you through what happened once that injunction actually took effect, because the halt to construction, combined with the growing awareness among the hundreds of families who had already placed deposits that something had gone seriously wrong with the project they'd committed to, triggered a level of public and legal scrutiny that Heartcrest Development Group and Priscilla's board clearly had not anticipated when they proceeded with that groundbreaking ceremony. Scrutiny that would eventually reveal exactly how this remarkable failure had actually occurred, and exactly how many other decisions along the way had been made with a similarly troubling disregard for basic verification. The discovery process that followed, once the injunction halted construction and formal litigation began in earnest, revealed exactly how this had happened, and I want to walk you through it, because the underlying story turned out to be considerably more troubling than a simple clerical oversight. Rosalind's investigation, combined with information that emerged through the litigation's formal discovery process, established that Heartcrest Development Group had, years earlier, entered into a preliminary purchase agreement with my father for a portion of the family land. An agreement my father had ultimately declined to finalize after the negotiated price fell through during a dispute over an environmental assessment that revealed a section of wetlands the developer wanted excluded from the purchase price calculation. That preliminary agreement, never finalized, never resulting in any actual transfer of title, had apparently sat in Heartcrest's internal files for years, and when the company's development planning team began mapping out Phase 3 nearly a decade later, working from outdated internal records rather than conducting a fresh title search, they had apparently simply assumed the land had been successfully acquired at some point, an assumption nobody along the entire chain, not the planning team, not Priscilla's board, not even, apparently, Heartcrest's own legal department, had bothered to verify against actual current county title records before moving forward with public promotion, buyer deposits, and eventually physical groundbreaking. This is, professionally speaking, One of the more remarkable failures of basic due diligence I've encountered, Rosalind told me, once the discovery records made the full picture clear. A title search is one of the most basic, standard steps in any real estate development process. And the fact that a project of this scale, 500 homes, proceeded all the way through public promotion and actual construction start without anyone conducting one, suggests either a genuinely stunning level of institutional carelessness or a willingness to simply proceed on assumption, because slowing down to verify would have delayed a project that had already generated significant financial momentum and buyer excitement. I want to walk you through what happened to the hundreds of families who had already placed deposits on Phase 3 homes, because their situation, once this became public, generated a level of outrage that I think mattered enormously for how quickly this entire situation was ultimately resolved. Many of these families had already begun making plans around their anticipated new homes, some having sold or listed their current residences, others having enrolled children in schools zoned for the new development, all of it now thrown into uncertainty by a title dispute that had nothing whatsoever to do with any decision they'd made, and everything to do with a developer and HOA board that had apparently never bothered to confirm they actually owned the land they were selling homes on. I want to tell you about the community meeting Heartcrest and the HOA board were eventually forced to hold, once word of the injunction and the underlying title dispute became impossible to keep quiet, given how many affected families were, understandably, demanding answers. I did not attend that meeting personally, since my own legal position was already well established through the injunction, but Rosalind attended as an observer and described it to me afterward as one of the more contentious HOA-adjacent gatherings she'd witnessed in her career, with affected buyers, several of whom had already begun packing for anticipated moves, directing considerable fury at both Heartcrest's representatives and at Priscilla directly, who had, throughout the promotional campaign for Phase 3, personally and repeatedly, assured the community that the project was fully secured and ready to proceed. I want to walk you through the specific question one buyer reportedly asked at that meeting, because Rosalind told me it captured the room's mood better than almost anything else said that evening. A woman who had already sold her previous home and moved her family into temporary rental housing pending her new construction's completion asked, directly, whether anyone on the board or at Heartcrest had actually verified the land's ownership before accepting her deposit. And when neither Priscilla nor the Heartcrest representative present could offer a clear, confident answer, the room's reaction, according to Rosalind, made unmistakably clear exactly how this entire situation was going to be remembered within the community going forward. I want to walk you through how the underlying title dispute itself resolved, because it moved forward on a separate track from the broader buyer fallout, though the two ultimately intersected in a way that shaped my own final decision about the land. Facing an unambiguous title record clearly establishing my family's continuous ownership, and no credible evidence of any completed transfer, Heartcrest's legal team ultimately conceded the title question entirely rather than continuing to contest a case with essentially no viable defense, a concession that formally confirmed my ownership beyond any further dispute and left the development's actual Phase 3 footprint effectively unbuildable as originally planned. I want to tell you about the decision I ultimately made regarding the land itself, because I think it matters for how this story concludes. Heartcrest, facing hundreds of furious deposit holders and a now unbuildable development plan, approached me directly, through Rosalind, proposing an actual, legitimate purchase of the disputed parcel at a considerably higher price than their original preliminary agreement with my father had ever contemplated. An offer that reflected, I think, both genuine desperation to salvage some version of their Phase 3 project and appropriate compensation for land that had, after all, sat productively in my family for 60 years, before anyone tried to build on it without permission. I want to be honest about the negotiation that followed, because it took several months and involved considerably more legal back and forth than a simple purchase agreement typically would, given how thoroughly Rosalind insisted on protecting my interests after everything that had already happened. We ultimately reached an agreement, a sale at a price reflecting the land's genuine current market value, along with specific provisions requiring Heartcrest to establish a dedicated buyer protection fund, compensating affected deposit holders for the delays, temporary housing costs, and general disruption the entire ordeal had caused them, a provision I insisted on as a condition of finalizing the sale at all, understanding that hundreds of families had been harmed by decisions entirely outside their own control. I want to tell you what happened to Priscilla, because the fallout for her personally extended well beyond the immediate embarrassment of that contentious community meeting. Once the full scope of the failed due diligence became public, several residents who had never even placed deposits on Phase 3 homes, simply longtime community members embarrassed by how badly the entire situation reflected on Willowmere Ridge's governance, organized a formal recall effort. And Priscilla, facing what had become an overwhelming loss of community trust, resigned from the board before that recall vote ever needed to actually take place. I want to tell you about the land now, because Phase 3, once construction eventually resumed under the finalized purchase agreement, actually began delivering homes to those original deposit holders about 14 months after that initial groundbreaking ceremony, considerably delayed from Heartcrest's original timeline, but ultimately completed, with the compensation fund provisions helping to ease at least some of the genuine hardship those families had experienced during the uncertainty. If there's a lesson in this story, I think it's something Rosalind said to me during one of our early meetings, reviewing the county title records alongside the elaborate Phase 3 promotional materials Heartcrest had already distributed before ever confirming they held clear title to build on. She said that institutional momentum, once a project has generated enough financial commitment, public promotion, and organizational excitement, tends to create a powerful, dangerous pressure to simply keep moving forward rather than pause to verify basic underlying assumptions, a dynamic that can allow genuinely fundamental problems, like not actually owning the land you're building on, to go unexamined for years. Right up until the exact moment a groundbreaking shovel breaks ground on someone else's 60-year-old family property. We stop the momentum, and it turns out that one clean 60-year title record, one attorney who moved fast enough to halt construction before it went any further, and one groundbreaking ceremony held on land that had never belonged to anyone involved in planning, it were more than enough to make sure Priscilla Ashworth Vandermeer's crowning achievement became, instead, the reason her entire board presidency came to an abrupt and thoroughly humbling end. Thumbnail text. They built 500 homes on MY land.